What's going on, everyone? My name is Jer'Lisa Devezin. I'm an interdisciplinary artist from New Orleans, Louisiana. I moved to Dallas in 2017, and I now live and work in Dallas, working for Dallas College as an instructional specialist and an adjunct professor as well for Tarrant County. Today, I'm here to talk to you about the artworks of Renee Stout in the DMA collection, artworks titled Fetish Number 1 and Fetish Number 2. I also go into a little detail about the influences of the 𝗏𝗄𝗄 and 𝗏𝗲𝗃 power figures from the artworks of the Congo peoples in Africa. Looking forward into Renee Stout's work, I began to research her in 2015, where I just typed in a simple Google search, Black women sculptors. Came Renee Stout, Fetish Number 2 just popped up in the images, and so I started to research this. When I started to research this, I saw that her influences were from African art, Haitian voodoo or hoodoo, and she also connected ties and studies to 𝗲𝗏𝗶𝗴𝗵𝗁, who is a voodoo queen from New Orleans. In this work, she talks about ritual, self-portrait, identity, and conjure. A few connections I'm going to make today are going to be regarding Fetish Number 1 and Fetish Number 2, starting with Fetish Number 1. But I'm going to give first a little background of the 𝗏𝗄𝗄 and 𝗏𝗲𝗃 power figures. 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗄 and 𝗏𝗃 power figures are objects that are made by a specific sculptor, which is called either, in the Western terminology, they called it a fetishist, or an 𝗏𝗏𝗃, which is a very specific sculptor within the community who has the ability to create these sculptures. In these sculptures, there's two different types, and a lot of people don't really realize that, which we say 𝗏𝗏𝗃 and 𝗏𝗏𝗃, but the 𝗏𝗏𝗃 is actually a little different from the 𝗏𝗏𝗃. The 𝗏𝗏𝗃 being a smaller statue, which can range about no taller than 15 inches tall. They are not pierced with nails. They are adorned with cloths, fabrics, fibers, collected beads, and things of that nature to ornament them, and they're more sacred and personal for an individual or an household. The larger 𝗏𝗏𝗃 figures usually stand between 35 to 47 inches tall, no taller than that, and they are more ceremonial for outside or public spaces where there is a larger collective group that is meeting. Both statues have a cavity in either their back or in their stomach, which holds either medicine or sacred potions or sacred objects that the sculptor or the 𝗏𝗏𝗃 may embellish them with and put inside of them, so that when the figure is activated, it can work its magic and do what it was made or deemed to do. As we look at Fetish Number 1, I began to make the connection that this was not an 𝗏𝗏𝗃, it wasn't a full 𝗏𝗏𝗃. It was more, for me, it came off as an 𝗏𝗏𝗃 because it was more personal. And then after doing more research and hearing Renee Stout talk about that actual piece, I found that the hair weave that it is adorned with actually fell from a child that she was teaching, or that a child on the playground, and she asked the young lady if she could have that piece of hair, and she took it, and she later adorned the sculpture with that piece of hair. A lot of this influence came from this piece where she was influenced by the wrapping of mummies, which, as you can see, the top of the work is just wrapped, and that whole artwork, she just consistently just wrapped with fabrics, adorned with collected beads, hair weave, coins, objects that she just deemed that were personal to her and that would influence that artwork. Looking at Fetish Number 2, which is a much larger sculpture, and it is actually life-size and true to Renee Stout's size, and is actually larger than a traditional 𝗏𝗏𝗃, she still plays on that reference by adorning the figure with hair weave, with little sacks of bags which can reference magical potions or medicines. She has if you take a closer look into the belly of the Fetish Number 2 power figure, it is embellished with an image of a baby, and it is embellished with a stamp from Africa. And this is a representation and an ode to Africa and of fresh breath, or a baby's breath. To add to Fetish Number 2, the hairpiece that is worn by the figure was actually worn around the house by Renee Stout while either making the piece or just while she just was wearing roundhouse and adorned that piece with that hair that she had been charging, if you will, to give that piece its power. And then if you take a closer look at the eyes, it's not just regular eyes. The eyes are embellished with cowrie shells, which can also mean abundance, and it also has many other cultural references. Comparing all three of these figures, I'm making a strong connection of history. I'm making a strong connection of representation and representation of Black womanhood as a self-portrait from Renee Stout's standpoint. And how this plays an integral part into my work is because I am working in some of the similar processes in which Renee Stout does. Like when I looked up her work, I saw works on paper, I saw photography, I saw sculpture, all those things that resonated me. And being that I come from interdisciplinary programs where it wasn't discipline based, I was able to play and communicate in these different mediums. And I actually ran across a old statement of Renee Stout's where she actually talked about the reason why she uses all these different mediums to communicate is because it's different when you put beads on something. It's different when you put hair that you have worn on a figure. It's different when you're trying to activate a sculpture versus just having it stand still. And for me, that is where the power comes from in these three figures, is because they're charged with so much personal influence and historical influence and reference within those works. Another thing that stands out for me about Renee Stout's work is the self-portraiture. I myself work in self-portraiture and sometimes performance to activate my sculptures. So for me to see her stand against her life-size portrait of herself, it was a very powerful and representational thing to see, especially for Black women. While making more connections, I became aware of the intention made in the artwork. So looking at the way that Renee Stout was intentional about these objects that she adorned her figures with, it made me more aware to say, okay, be more intentional about your own artwork, to put yourself in it and just to be bold about it and experiment and explore. And for me, that made me want to just lead in and communicate in many different ways, whether that's creating a figure that's in bronze or creating a figure that's completely made out of fibers. And to go into depth a little bit about how her work actually influenced evolution of how I made the jump from works on paper to sculpture. I began to cast small works in bronzes, which I also called fetishes, but that's not the title of them. To go into the fetish a little bit. So a fetish can exist in a lot of different ways. Sometimes a fetish can be this big and it's something that's personal and you can hold it and you can, admire it, or you can put it in your pocket. Sometimes a fetish can be life size. It depends on how your intentions for that piece, how it's meant to be seen, and what gaze is it meant to be looked from. So with that being said, 𝗏𝗏𝗶𝘀 was a self-portrait that I was exploring just to give myself a representation, because I wanted to see what it would look like to have a lesbian inspired sculpture that was actually named 𝗏𝗏𝗶𝘀, to see that in bronze. And so I had to create that so I can see that representation for myself and just to have it there. And once again, just thinking about Black bodies, thinking about being intentional about that work, and just representation is something that we're looking for in the Black community, so that we can see these images of ourselves represented. And in another work, 𝗔𝗍𝗄𝗏, that piece is heavily influenced by the 𝗦𝗍𝗁𝗃𝗃 or 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗃 figures, due to the pieces adorned with nails. It has very, very specific adornments as far as the Nike check on the shoes, or the text that is on the shoes as well. And lastly, Buku Sha of Madam C.J. Walker Ain't Got Nothing on Me. That is a piece that is completely inspired by the representation of Black people, Black hair, and just the whole piece is made of synthetic hair and fibers. So all that to come together and say, if Renee Stout hasn't taught me anything, she's taught me to communicate in whatever way I want to create, and there is no one way to create things. And no, I don't have to deem myself as a painter all the time to say, oh, well, I made this work on paper. But it's all about that communication and how that audience experienced that work. If you're interested in checking out more of Renee Stout's work, come down to the DMA and check out the African art section. You won't be disappointed.